Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Idaho, October 19, 2019. A 49-year-old school librarian, Tammy Daybell, is found unresponsive in her own bed at a home in the Salem-Rexburg area. First responders record no forced entry, no obvious trauma, no signs of a struggle. Local authorities process the scene, document the room, and note the absence of overt criminal indicators. The death is initially treated as unexpected but natural, a conclusion that, on paper, closes a file and lets a small town return to routine. The routine doesn't hold. In the weeks that follow, a separate investigation begins to surface, involving two missing children known to Idaho law enforcement. Cross-agency calls link timelines. Detectives do what detectives do, they reread recent deaths that might now deserve a second look. Tammy's file is pulled, the paperwork re-examined, and the first decision is procedural, not dramatic: preserve options. That includes safeguarding biological samples, preserving scene photos, and logging who handled what and when. The tone is clinical by design. If there is a crime here, it must be proved by the record, not by rumor. Neighbors describe a quiet household. Co-workers describe a reliable employee. Friends describe no obvious medical crisis in the days prior. Those statements don't prove anything on their own, but in a death review they matter. They shape what questions doctors and investigators ask when context shifts. In the background, detectives begin aligning phone records, travel dates, and messages from people connected to the household. Nothing is announced publicly. No speculation is entered into a report. The work is to test the original assumption, and only change it when the data compels it. By late 2019, that assumption does change. With proper authorization, Tammy's body is exhumed in Utah for a complete post-mortem. The path forward is forensic: re-examine soft tissue, perform histology, reassess airway structures, review lividity timelines, and evaluate any subtle signs that could have been missed when the death carried a natural label. This is not a search for a story, it's a search for mechanism. If the mechanism contradicts the paperwork, the manner of death must be corrected. In towns like Rexburg and Salem, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. You will not hear an accusation in this chapter. You will hear why a quiet bedroom in Idaho could not stay filed as routine. Separate facts: two children gone missing, travel that didn't square with responsibilities, digital traces that raised questions, will soon intersect with a shovel and a warrant. For now, the case remains what it is at the end of day one: a death that looked natural, reclassified by process, and placed back under the microscope because other facts demanded it. When Tammy's file was pulled for review, it wasn't because of a rumor. It was because two minors tied to the same circle had stopped showing up where records said they should be. Tylee Ryan wasn't in school or on verified calls after early September 2019. Joshua J.J. Vallow, a child with documented needs, missed services and routine check-ins later that same month. In police work, silence on official systems, attendance, benefits, medical appointments, reads louder than any tip line. Rexburg officers began with the simplest demands: produce proof of life. Texts or hearsay didn't count. Investigators wanted third-party confirmations: teachers, neighbors, clinicians, digital sign-ins that occur when a phone authenticates to a network. None arrived. The adults connected to the children left Idaho and surfaced in Hawaii without the kids. That movement wasn't a crime on its own, but it hardened the posture of the case. Welfare checks became a missing persons investigation. And once children are unaccounted for, every related death in proximity is rescored for risk. The paper trail formed the first layer. School and service records froze. No new insurance claims for ordinary care. No prescription refills that would be expected for JJ. The digital layer came next. Investigators subpoenaed account activity, logins, device pings, and cloud backups. You don't need the content of a message to know a device is no longer where it used to be. Metadata said enough. Familiar phones went dark or changed patterns abruptly in the second half of September. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Witness interviews were structured, not open-ended. Officers asked for dates, not stories. Who saw Tylee after the trip dates on record? Who interacted with JJ in person after the last documented school contact? Neighbors recalled vehicles, but not the children. Clerks remembered adults, not the kids. Surveillance from routine places, a storage facility, a retail parking lot, confirmed movements of grown-ups packing or shopping, but no verifiable frames of the minors beyond early fall. In towns like Rexburg and Salem, that gap is not just strange, it's operationally decisive. With the minors missing, detectives resorted every nearby incident by time adjacency and relationship adjacency. Tammy's October 19th death fit both categories. That didn't prove anything about her cause of death, but it justified controls, preserve her file, audit chain of custody, and request what would become the turning point, exhumation for a complete autopsy. The standard is straightforward. When fresh facts undermine the assumptions baked into an earlier certification, you reopen the body of work, sometimes literally. The tone inside the task room stayed dry. Investigators mapped calendars, phone metadata, and travel receipts on the same timeline bands. They flagged contradictions, public statements that didn't match device location, claims of child safety without independent confirmation. No one declared motive. No one named a killer. The objective was narrower: locate the children and reconcile Tammy's death with the now changed context. That is why this second chapter exists, not to dramatize, but to explain why casework shifted from paperwork to shovels. Families watching from outside often ask why agencies won't just say what everyone is thinking. Because a case that leaks theory before it secures evidence risks losing both. Instead, investigators documented the absence: no fresh school records, no medical continuity, no independent sightings, no authenticated digital activity from the children. They documented the presence: adults traveling, financial activity continuing, devices moving in patterns that excluded two minors who should have been visible somewhere. The contradiction didn't point to a person yet. It pointed to action, the kind that leads to warrants. By the end of this phase, the priority stack was set. Find Tylee. Find JJ. Re-examine Tammy's death with full forensic authority. Keep the public briefings tight to avoid contaminating witness recall. Hold the line on proof of life. The human cost is obvious, but in this work you move on what you can prove, not what you fear. That discipline is why, months later, a property search would be greenlit, and why the conclusions about Tammy would not stay where they started. The review team had enough cause to move. A county prosecutor in Idaho signed off, Utah authorities coordinated the logistics, and a judge authorized what every investigator treats as a last resort: take the case back to the body. Late 2019, Tammy Daybell was exhumed under controlled conditions with full chain of custody. The request wasn't theatrical. It was designed to answer one narrow question: does the physiology match a natural death, or not? Exhumations are slow by design. A lead investigator narrates the sequence into an evidence camera, a medical examiner verifies identification markers, each transfer is logged down to the minute. Personal effects are documented, resealed, and restored. There are no side conversations on the record, there's the checklist. The file that once read unexpected natural is now tagged for complete reevaluation, because context has changed and the law requires cause and manner to be supported by more than inference. At the medical examiner's office, the second look autopsy isn't a redo of paperwork, it's a redo of assumptions. Pathologists examine airway structures, soft tissues, and small internal indicators that can be subtle when first responders see no obvious trauma at a bedroom scene. Tissue sampling is expanded, histology slides are prepared, toxicology is reviewed alongside medical history. A senior examiner explains it plainly: the outcome must fit the observed evidence, not the other way around. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. The findings shift the case. The examiner amends the manner of death to homicide, with a mechanism consistent with asphyxiation by suffocation. For viewers, the key point is procedural. A manner change doesn't name a perpetrator. It recalibrates everything else. An amended death certificate triggers new investigative steps, case link analysis, digital warrant renewals, re-interviews, and a broader look at financial paperwork that might now carry a different weight. What was once a local loss treated as natural becomes a homicide investigation with multi-jurisdiction reach. With the manner amended, Idaho investigators build out a new operations plan. They prioritize evidence that either supports or contradicts the timeline that surrounded the home death. Scene photos from October are re-audited for items that made sense under a natural death assumption but read differently under homicide, bedding positions, medical devices, ambient conditions. Nothing is rewritten, everything is reinterpreted under the new legal posture. In towns like Rexburg and Salem, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community, so the team keeps the circle tight and the disclosures minimal. What does this change in the real world? First, it raises the bar for any person of interest, because statements made when a case looked routine get measured against forensic conclusions made later. Second, it legitimizes new search efforts that might have seemed aggressive under a natural death file. Third, it anchors future courtroom testimony to science rather than speculation. Homicide by asphyxiation is a carefully used conclusion. The medical standard is conservative. When a coroner or medical examiner signs it, investigators know they're working with a corrected map. Defense voices, present or anticipated, matter in this phase, too. Investigators prepare for competing experts who may argue the physiology is nonspecific or that suffocation indicators can be misread post-mortem. That's why the state focuses on documentation. Every observation is logged, every sample is tracked, every opinion is tied to a method and a slide. If a jury ever hears it, they won't be asked to trust a hunch, they'll be asked to weigh a protocol. This is also where human impact belongs, briefly and without sentimentality. A community that thought it had buried a loved one under the rules of nature is told the rules have changed. Families are notified through official channels, not headlines. A librarian with ordinary routines is now the center of a homicide file. For the investigative team, the job is to translate a medical conclusion into lawful steps that find corroboration in the world, movements, messages, locations, and later, property searches that must be justified by more than suspicion. Operationally, the amended manner of death opens doors. Cross-state coordination strengthens, because now Utah's autopsy, Idaho's casework, and related Arizona inquiries can share more efficiently within legal bounds. Digital warrants targeting historical device locations gain clarity in their probable cause narratives. Financial subpoenas move from background to relevant motive avenues. And a careful inventory of statements, what people claimed about sleep, health, timelines, gets stacked against a simple, sober fact: the body says homicide. For viewers following this case step by step, note what we're not doing here. We are not naming a killer in this stage of the story. We are not theorizing why a homicide occurred. We're showing how a routine file became a homicide case because a second autopsy said it had to. The science moved the needle, the law followed. As the calendar turns to 2020, that alignment, medicine and law pointing the same direction, will justify the next phase, a search that brings the investigation out of files and into the ground. The case moved from screens to soil in early June 2020. Investigators had compiled months of records, account activity, historical device locations, and travel traces tied to the same small circle already under review in Idaho. With Tammy Daybell's manner of death amended to homicide, the legal threshold changed. A judge signed a warrant authorizing a ground search at a Salem property associated with Chad Daybell. The warrant wasn't speculative, it relied on map movements and time windows that placed a connected device at specific coordinates when two miners were last verifiably active. On June 9, 2020, the operation began. A search like this runs on process. The team staged outside the property line, photographed entry points, and established a single path for personnel to keep the scene uncompromised. A mobile command post tracked assignments, excavation grid, evidence logging, photography, canine runs were allowed. If you've never watched it up close, it isn't dramatic. It's careful. Shovels move inches at a time. Crews sieve soil. Every change in texture or odor is noted and called out on camera. When the first anomaly appeared, soil density inconsistent with the surrounding yard, the crew slowed further and widened the perimeter. This was not guesswork. The area of interest was selected because the digital timeline converged there. Location records from a known associate's device put it on that parcel during a critical window in September 2019. That alone doesn't prove a crime, but it points to where to dig. The team cleared vegetation, peeled back topsoil, and documented every layer. Items that had no reason to be present in undisturbed ground began to emerge: binding materials, plastic sheeting, and other components consistent with concealment. Each was photographed in place, measured, and bagged with a unique identifier. When human remains were located, the tempo changed, but the rules didn't. Work stopped. The medical examiner's office was notified. The excavation widened so the recovery could happen intact, not piecemeal. You don't rush that moment. Identification would come later through established methods, but the working assumption on scene was clear: the search had shifted from a missing persons operation into a recovery. The discovery required immediate scene expansion, additional documentation, and a second grid to ensure no peripheral evidence was missed. A separate area on the property drew attention based on the same device history overlays: timestamped pings clustered in a narrow zone beyond the main yard. The team repeated the method: surface documentation, shallow scrape, then measured excavation with continuous video. More remains were located, along with materials that, in combination with the context, suggested deliberate concealment. The decision-making stayed clinical. No one announced conclusions to cameras. The only statement that mattered was the one made by the ground. Once recovery was complete, the chain of custody entries multiplied: personnel logs, bag seals, transport times. Back at the lab, these items would be tested, compared, and charted against the device timeline that led investigators to the property. The person named on the warrant, Chad Daybell, was detained that day. That's not a declaration of guilt. It's a procedural response when remains are recovered on property tied to a case already under a homicide posture. The immediate goal was to preserve everything: the yard, the items, and the timeline that brought the team there. For families, this is the worst possible confirmation. The recovery meant the search for Tylee Ryan and Joshua J.J. Vallow would not end with a live reunion. Law enforcement briefed next of kin through official channels, not headlines. In a case like this, compassion and discipline both matter. One acknowledges what was lost. The other ensures the case is built so that the truth holds in court. What changed after June 9th was scope. The investigation had a physical core now, not just records and suspicion. Prosecutors could connect movements to a place to items, and items to forensic findings that would be disclosed later in court. From a viewer's perspective, the most important point is simple: the search team didn't find answers by accident. They found them by following logs, warrants, and a clock that never stopped running in the background. For those of you tracking how these decisions get made, here's the operational takeaway: digital evidence doesn't convict on its own, but it tells you where to look. And when the ground corroborates what the logs predicted, the case leaves the realm of maybe and enters one that a jury can evaluate. The search turned into evidence the moment the bags were sealed. From there, the case belonged to the lab. Technicians logged each item from the Salem property: plastic sheeting, cords, tape, fabric layers, soil samples, then photographed, weighed, and cut controlled swatches for testing. Separate teams handled biological screening, trace collection, and tool mark work so conclusions wouldn't bleed across benches. It wasn't about drama, it was about building a record a jury could trust. Identification came first. For Joshua J.J. Vallow, the path forward was direct. Dental comparisons and DNA confirmation established identity, then the examination focused on what the wrappings and bindings showed about how he died. The configuration, tape over the mouth and face, layers restricting movement, wasn't an accident of burial. It was deliberate preparation before concealment. The medical conclusion was consistent with asphyxiation. In plain terms, JJ did not die of exposure after the fact. He was killed, then buried. For Tylee Ryan, the work was harder. Remains had been burned and fragmented. Analysts recovered bone, teeth, and small tissue remnants in sifted soil. When heat and dismemberment enter a case, the cause of death can remain undetermined even while the manner stays homicide. That's the paradox of forensic science. Destruction can hide a specific mechanism, but it does not erase intent. The lab documented burn patterns, recovered metal fragments where present, and mapped cut surfaces where possible. Each conclusion stayed inside its lane, what could be seen and measured, not what anyone feared or believed. Trace results added context without overselling. Soil on plastic layers matched the property strata where each set of remains was recovered. Adhesive lifts captured hairs and fibers suitable for comparison. Where DNA persisted, on tape edges, on interior surfaces, profiles were developed or ruled out. Many items yielded no useful ridge detail, burial and weather degrade latent impressions quickly. That in itself told a simple story. This was not a recent disposal at the time of recovery. It had been in the ground through seasons. The lab timeline mattered. Analysts compared estimated post-mortem intervals against known device movements on key dates in September 2019. That overlay didn't identify a killer, it tested sequence. If burial had occurred in the window suggested by the digital records, decomposition stages and insect activity would fall within certain ranges under Idaho conditions. Reports described ranges, not certainties, but the pattern held. The bodies had been placed when the phones and vehicles under scrutiny were active near that parcel. This is what prosecutors later described as corroboration. It's also what defense experts would probe on cross, the limits of interval estimates and the risk of confirmation bias. The work stands because each method is disclosed. A second wave of analysis targeted packaging. Cut marks on tape were compared to control cuts made with seized blades. Widths and edge features were charted, though matches are rarely individualizing in the way TV suggests. Plastic layers were examined for brand, lot characteristics, and retail distribution to see if purchase records could be tied to known transactions. That thread matters when motive is contested. Receipts, loyalty card hits, and surveillance from a store can place an adult with specific materials. In this case, investigators highlighted what could be proven and skipped what couldn't. The record remained spare by design. Medical conclusions were distilled into plain English for later court. JJ, homicide by asphyxiation with bindings and a covering consistent with suffocation. Tylee, homicide, mechanism undetermined due to burning and dismemberment. Both were deceased before burial. Neither set of remains arrived on that property by accident or act of nature. When families listened to that language in court, it landed like a second loss. The words are clinical, but the meaning is not. We keep that in mind here. Facts first, people always in view. The lab also tightened the connection back to Tammy Daybell. Her amended manner of death, homicide by suffocation, now stood alongside two child homicides tied to the same property and relationships. Investigators were cautious about sequence. Tammy's case involved a home death without obvious external trauma. The children's cases involved post-mortem concealment on land under the defendant's control. Different scenes, different mechanics, one expanding pattern of evidence. That pattern is what allowed the next steps, financial subpoenas, message timelines, belief system exhibits, to be argued as relevant later. But this chapter stays on the science. The ground confirmed what the missing persons work feared. I've watched families sit through this part with quiet focus. They want explanations more than adjectives. Why this layer of tape? Why these cuts? Why this spot on that property? The answers are simple and unbearable: restraint, silence, concealment. In towns like Rexburg and Salem, violent crime is not abstract. It breaks into the daily calendar, school runs, grocery lists, church schedules, and redraws them around hearings and anniversaries. The job here is to carry the details without letting them consume the people at the center of them. By the time the lab finished its core work, the case file had three pillars: Tammy's reclassified homicide, JJ's asphyxiation, and Tylee's homicide with destroyed evidence. Add the digital map that led to the yard, and the investigators had enough to move beyond recovery into charging decisions. That's where this story goes next: how the state stacked counts, why trials split, and what evidence would be allowed to frame motive without turning proceedings into a referendum on belief. By the time the lab reports were signed, investigators turned to why. In a homicide file, motive isn't required to convict, but it explains behavior that otherwise looks random. The team worked 3 lanes in parallel: money, communications, and belief-driven planning. Each lane used documents, timestamps, and sworn statements, material a jury can weigh without speculation. The money lane started with insurance. After Tammy Daybell's death certificate was amended to homicide, detectives audited policies, payout timing, and any beneficiary changes. Bank records showed deposits aligned with life insurance disbursements shortly after her death. That is not a crime by itself. Spouses commonly carry policies, but in a case where manner is homicide, financial activity becomes context. Investigators compared dates: when the claim was initiated, when a payout landed, and what followed: travel, purchases, or transfers. Those entries later helped prosecutors argue a triad of incentives: money, power, and sex. Defense counsel would counter that routine financial handling proves nothing about intent. The value for the jury was sequence, not shock. The second lane was messages. Subpoenaed texts and emails established a running clock of communications between adults at the center of the case. 2 details mattered. First, the tone and content around September 2019, when the children's last verified activity stops. Second, the September 9th message about shooting a raccoon and burying it in a pet cemetery on the Salem property, the same day a connected device's location history clustered in that yard. On its face, a raccoon story could be meaningless. On a timeline with human remains later recovered steps away, it read as narrative cover. Investigators didn't ask jurors to accept that interpretation blindly. They put the message next to the map, then next to the excavation logs. The pattern was the point. The third lane, the most sensitive, was belief-based planning. Prosecutors later argued that fringe religious claims were used to justify decisions that isolated and dehumanized. Courts are careful here. Belief itself is protected. It only enters a trial when it tends to prove planning, intent, or agreement to act. That is why the state sought to introduce select statements and rankings that labeled people as spiritually dark or light, tying those labels to later actions. The prosecution's theory: if someone is declared dark and beyond saving, harm can be framed as a form of deliverance. The defense pushed back, warning jurors not to criminalize faith or private talk. The judge drew lines: admit what is probative for intent, exclude what is unduly prejudicial. Pulling these lanes together, detectives built a clean chronology: insurance movements after October 19, 2019, synchronized messages and device pings in early September, belief language linked to decisions about spouses and children. None of those elements alone answers who beyond reasonable doubt. Together, they gave the case direction. Warrants expanded to capture purchase histories, tape, plastic, tools, so transaction logs could be compared with the materials recovered from the yard. Call detail records and cell site maps were re-rendered for courtroom display, minute by minute, avoiding the trap of dumping data without narrative. As a narrator, I try to keep this simple. Money shows pressure. Messages show coordination. Beliefs can show permission. Families listening don't need grand theories. They need to see how a text, a bank entry, or a label affected what happened next. If you're following along, ask yourself, which line of evidence would you find most persuasive if the rest were missing? For many jurors, it was the convergence, the way dates and words and deposits stacked in the same direction. This wasn't about demonizing a community or its faith. It was about proving that specific adults used specific ideas, communications, and financial choices in a way that aligned with 3 homicides. Once that frame was clear, the case moved into charging strategy: how to structure counts, whether to sever trials, and which exhibits would be allowed to tie planning to outcome without turning the courtroom into a referendum on belief. Once the lab work and motive lanes were organized, the file moved from investigation to prosecution. On May 25, 2021, Idaho prosecutors filed first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder charges tied to Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, along with related insurance fraud/grand theft counts. The charging documents didn't tell a story. They mapped elements the state believed it could prove: unlawful killing with malice, an agreement to commit the crimes, and a financial scheme that followed the deaths. Pretrial decisions shaped everything viewers later saw in court. First, severance. Trying both adult defendants together risked prejudice. Judges often split proceedings to protect due process and streamline evidence fights. Second, venue. The case drew intense local attention in eastern Idaho, so the trial was moved to Ada County to seat a neutral jury without abandoning Idaho law. Neither decision favored one side, both were about trial integrity. Discovery turned a mountain of records into admissible exhibits. The state produced forensics, autopsy findings, packaging, trace, digital evidence, device location histories, call detail records, communications, texts/emails including the September 9th raccoon message, and financials, policy paperwork, claim timelines. Defense counsel pushed for full access to lab notes and device forensics methods, hash logs, extraction tools, and analyst credentials so the jury could weigh reliability, not headlines. That friction is standard in a homicide case built heavily on corroboration rather than a single eyewitness. Evidentiary rulings drew bright lines. Judges allowed limited belief-based statements only where they tended to prove planning or intent, not to put a religion on trial. Messages and rankings that labeled people as spiritually dark were admitted when linked to later acts. Broader theology stayed out. The September 9th text about a raccoon and a pet cemetery cleared relevance because it sat on the same timeline as device pings to the yard that was later excavated. The defense warned of confirmation bias. The court answered with instructions: jurors decide weight, not lawyers. Counting matters in a capital-eligible case. Prosecutors charged alternative theories, principal liability and conspiracy, so the jury could convict if it found an agreement plus overt acts even without assigning each blow or binding to a specific hand. For Tammy, the amended manner of death, homicide by suffocation, anchored counts alleging planning inside the marital home. For Tylee and J.J., the recovery location and packaging supported homicide counts with distinct mechanics: one asphyxiation, one destroyed mechanism. The through line was agreement and action, not a single moment. With charging in place, the court addressed custody and conditions. In cases alleging multiple homicides, bail is typically denied or set beyond reach. The focus shifted to motions: suppress certain statements, limit certain demonstratives, clarify language in jury instructions for premeditation, conspiracy, and accomplice liability. The state previewed aggravators it might pursue at a penalty phase: heinous/cruel, multiple victims, and conduct showing utter disregard, while the defense prepared mitigation themes, from personal history to disputed forensics. From a narrator's seat, the most important point is practical. The court engineered a track where only probative evidence reached jurors, and each side could test the other's methods in daylight. No one asked the jury to trust instinct. They were asked to follow a timeline built from autopsy tables, message stamps, bank postings, and location points, then decide whether those pieces proved murder and conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt. This phase ended with a clear runway: counts filed, trial severed, venue shifted, exhibits filtered, and a jury pool ready to hear a case that now had a forensic spine and a documented motive frame. What came next was the test: live testimony, cross-examination, and a verdict that would set the penalty stage in motion. The case ended in a place only a complete record can take you: a verdict built on autopsy tables, device maps, and a steady stack of sworn exhibits. On May 30th, 2024, an Idaho jury found Chad Daybell guilty on all counts for the murders of Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, along with related fraud. No single piece carried the day. The chain did: Tammy's amended manner of death to homicide, the Salem property recovery, lab findings on cause and concealment, the September 9th messaging, and the money trail that followed. 2 days later, on June 1st, 2024, the same jury returned a death sentence under Idaho law, citing aggravators including multiple victims and conduct showing exceptional cruelty and utter disregard for human life. Capital cases trigger automatic review, but the jury's decision is clear and final at the trial level. The penalty phase was brief and focused. Prosecutors argued that 3 homicides, 1 spouse, 2 children met Idaho's highest threshold for punishment. The defense presented mitigation and cautioned against reading belief or private language as destiny. Jurors weighed what they were allowed to see, not theology, but actions, not rumor, but recordings, receipts, and remains. The law asked a hard question and the panel answered it unanimously. Sentencing brought victim impact to the front of the room. Family members spoke to 3 losses that reshaped their lives: a wife and mother whose death was first called natural, a teenage daughter whose remains showed destruction, a 7-year-old boy restrained and suffocated. The statements did not revisit evidence. They described holes in calendars, quiet bedrooms, and birthdays that passed with an empty chair. In a case this public, that restraint matters, grief framed by facts, not by spectacle. Community closure is never clean, but there were clear lessons worth keeping. First, re-auditing natural deaths when new context emerges is not second-guessing, it is good practice. Exhumation changed Tammy's file because the science demanded it. Second, digital plus physical, device history that points to a yard means nothing unless the yard speaks back. Here, it did. Third, interstate coordination matters. Utah's autopsy work, Idaho's warrants and search, and related Arizona proceedings moved in parallel without diluting Idaho's trial. Finally, for anyone caring for kids or vulnerable adults, proof of life isn't a hashtag, it's documentation, school, medical, services, third-party verification. When those lines go quiet, act early and ask for a welfare check. It's protective, not accusatory. One more point for consistency's sake, this story has a single ending. In Idaho, the defendant was convicted of the murders of Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, and sentenced to death on June 1, 2024. Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted in a separate Idaho trial in 2023 and received life without parole. Later Arizona sentences followed. Those outcomes do not change this verdict. They explain the wider circle, but the core case begins and ends in Fremont, Madison County, Idaho, with a jury's decision that stands unless an appellate court says otherwise. We close where we started, a quiet bedroom, a file that didn't make sense once missing children and hard evidence reframed it, and an investigation that refused to assume. Justice here was not fast, it was methodical. That is what kept the narrative from splitting into 2 stories and what turned suspicion into proof. For Tammy, for Tylee, for JJ, the record is built, the judgment is entered, and the outcome is singular. I'll leave you with this: cases don't solve themselves, people do. Document proof of life for the kids and elders in your world. When routines break, ask hard questions early. If a story doesn't add up, speak up. That's not paranoia, that's care for your community. What signs would make you call for a welfare check? Which safeguard matters most where you live? Drop your thoughts, and tell me where you're watching from. If this episode moved you or challenged you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case. And if it didn't work for you, say why. Your feedback makes this work better.